Hey Vineram, how are you doing? Want to start off by apologizing. I was probably a bit hasty to assume that you were just ignoring my videos, and I failed to neglect that you're a busy guy, so I apologize for that. Just given my prior experience with most creationists, I know how it works, and well, that's why I did what I did. So, apologize for the faulty assumption, and thank you for your response. To begin with, the second law of thermodynamics, it doesn't only apply to evolution, it applies to absolutely everything. The thing about it, though, is that you're not using it correctly or oversimplifying it and ignoring the vast majority of exceptions and things which make it apply perfectly to evolution. For example, I could do the exact same thing that you're doing and say that cleaning your room is impossible. Why? Because things go from order to disorder, not from disorder to order. How can cleaning your room be possible if it's getting cleaner? Entropy states that things are just getting more disordered. Well, of course, that's not possible. My room can be cleaned, although I haven't done it lately, obviously. But nevertheless, it's perfectly valid, and it applies to evolution, and it's not a confliction for evolution whatsoever. It doesn't necessarily go against it whatsoever. It supports it. I mean, everything's feasible under thermodynamics. It's just a matter of how you couple everything. Secondly, you're talking about the same evidence, and I don't think that we have the same evidence, because if you were to look at the summation of the evidence and absolutely everything that it shows, you would pretty much clearly see that evolution happens. I mean, yes, there are some things where the interpretation is to blame, and for example, I can think of a good example of that when you look at Neanderthal skeletons that are completely different than modern-day human skeletons, and instead of saying, this is a hominid species, you say, oh, they're just old humans with arthritis, and ignore the remaining 99% of skeletal features which contradict that theory, but that's just what you go on. Another thing is it really that bad? In the sense of, if I were to take a look at a photograph of the Earth, am I not viewing that as evidence for a round Earth under the presupposition that the Earth isn't flat? I mean, that's simply what you do. You're not ignoring evidence to the contrary, you're just taking it into context. So again, that's one thing about evolution, is that you have to look at the entirety of the evidence and what exactly all does it support. Next, going on, it shows that there's design in the universe. I'm not arguing that there's not a creator. I mean, I personally believe in God. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I am definitely a Christian. It's just a matter of, does that have to be hand-painted? I think that my creator, God, had the brilliance and the foresight to know and be able to set up a system knowing exactly what it would produce, as opposed to in the universe. Take a look at snowflakes. Some of the most ordered and amazingly beautiful things that occur naturally in nature. If you want, take a look at Google for images of snowflakes. Now that's pretty darn complex. Well, couldn't I just use their complexity as an evidence of a snowflake making God? How do we know that God doesn't make every single snowflake independently? Because that's pretty darn complex, especially if evolution's false. Or did God just have the foresight to set up a system knowing what the outcome would produce, be it snowflakes or us? Another thing about irreducible complexity that you were going on, I mean, there's a problem with, for example, the bacterial flagella, and I think that example illustrates everything nicely, is that things can have alternate functions. Do you follow me? So, for example, when it was shown that the base tail rotor, or the base of the flagella, was actually the same thing as a type 2 or type 3 secretory system in cells, that's a perfect example. Because it's already there. It wasn't originally designed for the flagella. It was simply what was already there, and evolution used it to make something new. Lots of things have other prior abilities. For example, if you take the faulty, horrible analogy of a watch, which I absolutely hate using, you could take the spring. Well, yes, the watch doesn't work without a spring, but how many things can springs be used for? Same thing with a gear. I mean, it's the same type of example, that all the things could have been there for different reasons just before it happened. And when you actually look at supposedly irreducible complex systems, that's what we find, that the majority of these things have alternate uses. Actually, all of them have alternate uses. Interestingly enough, by the way, Michael Behe accepts common descent. That is, that we share a common ancestor with the great apes. So moving on, when you, again, like you had already said about design in the universe and the complexity of the cells, like, we'll also take a look at mitochondria of our cells. I mean, they have their own DNA, reproduce independently. They've got the same biosynthetic and biochemical pathways that normal bacteria have. Indeed, it actually points to them being symbionts, and the fact that it's a prokaryotic cell that got moved into a eukaryotic cell. Same thing with chloroplasts. But something else that's interesting to note, though, is if evolution is false, then you should have no problem with many poisons or even some antibiotics, taking them in enormous doses, which hurt prokaryotes but not eukaryotes. Because, I mean, hey, evolution's false. These things, we don't share a common ancestor whatsoever. So why wouldn't you go ahead and take these? Why are these things poisonous? I mean, your mitochondria should be completely different from any prokaryotic organism. Which is actually something else that's interesting about evolution. And I had a patient today that, we'd been having a problem. She'd had a sore that simply would not heal. Tried antibiotic therapy. Nothing was really working. And didn't exactly know what to do. It wasn't healing. It was a problem. We couldn't pin down the exact organism that it was after doing enterotube, sending it off to lab, whatever. Still no luck. So sent her for 16S ribosomal typing. Now, if evolution is false, she should die. Simply because there's no reason that the typing should give up anything resembling a logical response. I mean, it should just be a random thing. Yet, millions of people are saved by that, and it helps us identify organisms definitively. But if evolution is false and things don't share a common ancestor, then the gradient that we have set up in the phylogenetic trees wouldn't apply, and our answer would be completely null and void. So, I don't know, I probably should have made her sign a waiver saying that she thinks, or that she accepts evolution before getting the test done, but oh well. Another example is if you talk about, and it's a perfect example about DNA that you were talking about compared with proteins. First of all, DNA is not made of proteins. Secondly, so they're not codependent. Secondly, what's necessary for life now isn't necessarily what was necessary at the beginning. For example, we need air. We need oxygen to complete cellular respiration, but there are many millions of organisms on the Earth that don't. You follow me? We need sunlight to make vitamin D in our skins, but many other organisms don't. If you remove us from air, we die. How could we have lived without air? Yet there are other organisms that could live just fine without air. In fact, many require the absence of oxygen. So I think that's a good example of what's true for us in the building blocks isn't necessarily true for what could have been made back then. For example, if you look at liposomes or anything like that, what happens when you put certain types of fatty acyl chains in water? That's exactly what we see. We see the phospholipid bilayer forming. I mean, that's the basics of a cell, and you have the beginning of the compartmentalization of inside from outside, and from there everything can go on, whether it's a protobiont, hypercycle, anything like that. But I mean, that's just, for example, a way that you can open up the door. But the point is that, perfect example, cyanide, completely toxic to us, and many creationists will assert that, oh, well, cyanide is toxic, and the early environment contained lots of cyanide. Life couldn't have evolved. Well, what they're failing to account for is the fact that cyanide's only toxic if you have a respiratory system and hemoglobin, which we do, but it doesn't conflict whatsoever with life evolving. I think that's a good example of what's true now wasn't necessarily always so. The last thing is complexity, just basically looking at anything and saying, it looks very complex, looks designed, therefore God had to have done it by hand painting. I mean, that's an argument from ignorance. I'm not saying that you're an ignorant person or anything. I'm referring to the logical fallacy of basically saying, I don't know, looks complicated, God did it. And lastly, about the random chance, like I said, even Michael Behe accepts common descent. So you're going to be hard-pressed to find anything. So please respond to this, let me know what you think, and if any of my errors, or if I have any errors in logic or anything like that, just let me know. Thanks again for your help.